The social media platform Telegram is an app used by nearly a billion users worldwide. Its CEO, Pavel Durov, was arrested earlier this week in Paris when he stepped off his private jet. He has since been released, but remains under investigation for allegations related to criminal activity being allowed on his app, and he's under a €5 million bail deal. Emmanuel Macron has said that this arrest is not political, but does it set a dangerous precedent for free speech worldwide? My name is Natasha Froese, you're watching Spectator TV, and I am delighted to be joined by Michael Shellenberger, a free speech advocate, journalist, and professor at the University of Austin, to discuss the arrest. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. The arrest happened earlier this week. He is still under investigation. But to begin with, for some of our users that don't know what Telegram is, could you explain it to us a little bit about the app and how it's different from other social media networks?
Sure. So Telegram is a combined messaging and social media app. So it's a little bit like, you may be familiar with WhatsApp or Signal. Those are messaging apps. But it also has a more social media function. So you can have large groups of people sharing information, up to 200,000 people. So it's a little bit of both. And it's, we can get into a little bit how it's different from those other apps, but that's basically what it is.
Could you explain a little bit about end-to-end encryption? Because my understanding is that it's only partially encrypted.
That's right. So there's something called end-to-end encryption, which means that nobody can read your messages, not even the company that's providing that service. So not even WhatsApp or Signal executives can read those end-to-end encrypted text messages. Now, Telegram is slightly different. Telegram does have an end-to-end encryption choice, but you have to choose something called secret chat in order for end-to-end encryption to be there. Otherwise, what Telegram's CEO and executives say is that the encryption is not end-to-end. It's only at the level of the server, and then the encryption codes are split up and spread between different servers. I should say that that's not really been confirmed, so we don't really know. And so Telegram is not an app personally I've ever used precisely because there is no end-to-end encryption. And, it's obviously but there's a very interesting history with Russia. So it's a little bit more of an edge case, I would say, than some of the other cases of censorship that we've seen.
What do you make of the arrest? Did you think that this does bring into danger issues of free speech? And also, I wanted to ask you, what do you think that the implications of the CEO of Telegram being arrested could have on the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, there's still a lot of mysteries that we don't yet know. I think it obviously set off a lot of alarm bells among those of us that have been tracking the crackdown on free speech, both because we've seen the European Union and other countries around the world, Brazil, Canada, we've seen them putting a lot of pressure on the social media companies to engage in more censorship. We've seen abuses of those powers. Most recently, the top censor in the European Union, a Frenchman named Thierry Breton, raised concern that Elon Musk was interviewing Donald Trump. That struck us Americans as a kind of electoral interference. And then he was upbraided for that by his colleagues. A couple of days later, it made the Financial Times. And so when we saw the arrest of the Telegram CEO, I think many of us were concerned that it was part of the same thing. The French government, of course, has now said that it was not about censorship, that it was really about the lack of cooperation from Telegram in dealing with criminal cases. Well, that would be different. I think most of us, myself included, support governments being able to, prosecute illegal forms of speech like child pornography or drug trafficking or terrorism. So I think the question remains what the real motivations were. As for the Russian war, there's a huge amount of speculation that this has something to do, with the war in Russia. We've seen NGOs that are very close to governments, funded by governments, raise concerns that Telegram has been used by Russians to wage information operations or propaganda operations in Africa. And certainly similar concerns raised about Russia Although it's just worth noting that Telegram allows both anti and pro-Russian information on its platform, so it doesn't seem particularly asymmetrical. But nonetheless, we just aren't sure yet what's happening.
Telegram's guidelines do say that it prohibits publicly promoting violence in any form, and Pavel Durov has said himself that he blocks any of this content. Do we have evidence of that happening?
Well, we do know that they have taken down content that was, overly violent in the past. And so it wouldn't be difficult to believe that there's been some selective enforcement of that. And I do think that there is a genuine public interest concern around selective enforcement. In other words, if for some reason the CEO of Telegram, and of course he insists that he's neutral, but if he were to some reason to favor one side or another in any conflict, whether Russia, Ukraine, or something in Africa, that could have a huge destabilizing impact, because it would basically function as propaganda, where one side is committing atrocities and the other side is not. That would be the perception that would be created. Of course, there are other ways of getting information. It's not like Telegram is the only source of information. I think the other detail here that's interesting that came out yesterday was that both the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and many senior members of the French government use Telegram. And in fact, the reporter who reported that noted that there were many senior French officials that were still on Telegram as recently as 24, 48 hours ago. So it's a very peculiar situation, because, and I think they also were saying that the French government had warned their own people within the government not to use Telegram, that it wasn't secure, but they went ahead and used it because of the convenience and the path dependency. So there's just a lot going on here that we still don't quite understand.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary part of the story, because Emmanuel Macron uses the app Telegram for a lot of his work, allegedly, and there is a world in which Pavel Durov has access to all of his private messages for governance.
That's right. It's a big oversight. I mean, very famously, when Barack Obama became president, they deprived him of some pretty basic functionality on his cell phone. So to know that Macron is engaged in using Telegram, it's pretty startling. I think that I'm pretty satisfied by the independent audits that have been done of Signal and WhatsApp encryption. And so, for me, and again, if someone were to take your phone and look at your phone, you would be able to see those messages if they're not disappearing. But nonetheless, between the two users, the encryption technology appears to be good, appears to be working. There was U.S. government support for those encryption technologies by Signal. The rationalization of it was that it helps to protect U.S. allies in different countries, including pro-democracy activists who need their communications to be encrypted to protect themselves from tyrannical governments. So the calculus had been, at least among Western governments, or at least among the U.S. government, that the benefits of end-to-end encryption outweighed the risks. I still think that's a pretty good calculation. There's still some complaints among policymakers once in a while in the United States about not being able to read end-to-end encrypted chats, but I think it's one of the few bright spots in a world where we're seeing increasing desires and demands from governments to crack down on free speech and invade people's privacy.
I did read one article in the Rolling Stones that the FBI does in fact have backdoor access to WhatsApp's end-to-end encryption. Is there evidence of that? And could that explain why, for example, Mark Zuckerberg hasn't come into problems?
People have speculated about that, but I have seen no evidence for it. And cryptology is obviously one of the most intellectually difficult domains of human life. So I wouldn't pretend to be able to verify, but there are independent audits that have been done on those encryption technologies, and they do say that both WhatsApp and Signal are end-to-end encrypted. So there shouldn't be a backdoor. And we have seen, and again, it could be, if it's an elaborate conspiracy, we have seen FBI repeatedly tell policymakers in the United States that they are not able to read those end-to-end encrypted chats. And I think if you asked me, I would say I think that's probably the case. I would be surprised if there's a backdoor. And you may know that Damien Collins, a former member of Parliament in Britain, was in a famous debate now with the CEO of Signal last year on British television, where he was arguing for giving law enforcement a backdoor, and Meredith Whittaker, the CEO of Signal, was vehemently arguing against it. I guess you could say it could be an elaborate conspiracy that somehow they both are just engaged in this kind of theater, but it's a little bit hard to believe. I do think that end-to-end encryption is really a real thing.
And Michael, you've had your own experience with government censorship. You broke the huge story last year called Twitter Files. For our audience that haven't heard about it, could you tell us about that?
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Sure. Well, let me give you the bottom line up front, because it's still a really spectacular, terrible story. But we now know, we can say definitively, that the FBI and the CIA broke multiple laws to spread disinformation about the Hunter Biden laptop and therefore interfere in the 2020 election. That the Aspen Institute had been going around to all the social media companies and the media, raising concerns that there would be a leak of information about Hunter Biden and Burisma. I discovered this after Mark Zuckerberg had gone on Joe Rogan.
How do you guys handle things when they're a big news item that's controversial? Like, there was a lot of attention on Twitter during the election because of the Hunter Biden laptop story. The New York
we
Post.
had that too.
Yeah, so you guys censored that as well?
So we took a different path than Twitter. Basically the background here is the FBI, I think, basically came to us, some folks on our team, and was like, hey, just so you know, like, you should be on high alert. We thought that there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. We have it on notice that basically there's about to be some kind of dump of that's similar to that. So just be vigilant. So our protocol is different from Twitter's. What Twitter did is they said you can't share this at all. We didn't do that. What we do is we have, if something is reported to us as potentially misinformation, important misinformation, we also have this third-party fact-checking program, because we don't want to be deciding what's true and false. And for I think it was 5 or 7 days when it was basically being determined whether it was false, the distribution on Facebook was decreased, but people were still allowed to share it. So you could still share it, you could still consume it.
So when you say the distribution is decreased,
it got shared.
How does that work?
It basically, the ranking in newsfeed was a little bit less. So fewer people saw it than would have otherwise. So it definitely...
By what percentage?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's meaningful. But basically, a lot of people were still able to share it. We got a lot of complaints that was the case. Obviously this is a hyper political issue, so depending on what side of the political spectrum, you either think we didn't censor it enough or censored it way too much. But we weren't sort of as black and white about it as Twitter. We just kind of thought, hey, look, if the FBI, which I still view as a legitimate institution in this country, it's like very professional law enforcement, they come to us and tell us that we need to be on guard about something, then I want to take that seriously.
Did they specifically say you need to be on guard about that story?
No, I don't remember if it was that specifically, but it basically fit the pattern.
So he didn't say, though, in that Joe Rogan interview that it was related to Burisma. So that is the additional new detail that confirms. And so the only way anybody would have known that there was a forthcoming leak of something related to Hunter Biden and Burisma is because the FBI was spying on Rudy Giuliani as he was out there trying to get a reporter to write about the Hunter Biden laptop, which he held the hard drives or copies of the hard drives in his possession. So it's an incredible story, because basically you see the FBI intervening on behalf of Joe Biden to basically spread disinformation about what was actually Hunter Biden's laptop, which indeed did show widespread influence peddling. The CIA then got involved because all of these former CIA directors and senior intelligence officials wrote an open letter saying that the laptop, after the New York Post article about the laptop came out, they sent an open letter saying that it had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. That letter was approved by the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, within a few hours. So in other words, they had to approve that letter being released. The approval of the letter is a political decision. All Gina Haspel had to do was to, first of all, slow the process down. This is completely beyond the pale. I mean, the intelligence services, for hundreds of years, the intelligence services, the police forces of the king or the president or whoever is the top ruler of the government, they are not allowed to weaponize those people for political purposes. That is illegal. It's very illegal. It's violating the sacred right that we have to have equal justice and equal protection under the law. So this is a very serious crime that was committed, and nobody has been held accountable for it. The conspiracy, and it's not a theory, the actual conspiracy involved a huge number of people. It involved the CIA, it involved the FBI, it involved the Aspen Institute, it involved Trump's director of the CIA. All of these people had looked at that information and decided it was Russian disinformation. I personally fell for it. I voted for Biden in 2020. I thought he would stabilize the country. When I heard about the Hunter Biden laptop and I saw all the publicity, I thought everybody's saying it's Russian disinformation, and it wasn't. There was never any evidence to support that. So it's a huge, huge scandal. It's unresolved. It's a stain on American democracy and our intelligence services.
And these characters, these people working in government, what has happened to them? Is there a trial going on? Is there an inquiry?
Nothing. There's nothing going on. Full credit to a member of Congress named Jim Jordan. He was the chairman of a special investigative committee on the weaponization of government. I testified twice in front of it last year with my friend Matt Taibbi, the journalist, about the Twitter files. And so nobody. I mean, you're talking about the head of the FBI and the head of the CIA potentially implicated in one of the most significant cases of electoral interference in American history. So no, there needs to be there should not be any statute of limitations on it. But it needs to be investigated, and the people that perpetuated this crime need to be brought to justice.
Speaking of Jim Jordan, just earlier this week, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, released a statement saying that he regrets how much the government interfered in his social media platforms' censorship over COVID. Do you think that there is any connection between Pavel Durov's arrest and Mark Zuckerberg deciding now to release this statement? He's had 4 years to say something, and do you think it's funny that it's happened now?
I don't know why it came out this week. I'm skeptical that it was a reaction to the arrest of Pavel Durov. I think that a letter like that Mark Zuckerberg writes, it's very carefully crafted. It came out, I believe, on Monday. Durov was arrested on Saturday. I mean, I guess it's possible, but I suspect it was in the works for a long time. And again, it's the same letter where he talks about the Hunter Biden laptop that he also talks about the COVID censorship. My read of it is that there was some unfinished business that Zuckerberg needed to do in that letter. He also explained his donations in 2020 that most Republicans view as partisan donations to help the Democrats. He insisted in the letter that those donations were simply to protect election integrity and to get out the vote. So it felt to me like he wanted to kind of put to bed a bunch of unresolved questions around Facebook that probably based on information that they were all receiving, that Facebook is still perceived as biased towards Democrats. I will say on the COVID misinformation, the one thing I think British listeners should know is that what the US and Britain did on COVID misinformation was eerily similar. You had very similar social media monitoring, very similar involvement of intelligence and military agencies, mass censorship efforts aimed at censoring not just not just inaccurate information, but also accurate information that people feared would result in vaccine hesitancy. Facebook, when the White House was pressuring Facebook to censor concerns around vaccines, Facebook said to the White House, they said, our research shows that if you censor this information, you'll increase vaccine hesitancy. You will increase the public's suspicion that there's something wrong with the vaccines. Why would you need to censor it why would you need to censor this information if there's not something wrong with the vaccines? That's the thought process that people have when they see the censorship. The White House said, censor it anyway. Facebook censored what Facebook called true stories of vaccine side effects. So it was an egregious abuse of power by the White House. Unfortunately, none of that information had come out before a Supreme Court lawsuit was filed last year, and we lost in the Supreme Court, really on standing, not on the substance. Had that Zuckerberg letter come out before the Supreme Court deliberations, I think there's a good chance the Supreme Court would have ruled a different way. And there may be another maybe another bite at that apple around the Supreme Court. But as you know, and your listeners know, we have extremely strict First Amendment free speech standard in the United States. It's the strongest in the world. So any whiff of the U.S. government attempting to abridge, that's the language in the First Amendment, or limit free speech is strictly forbidden.
And yet nothing has happened to these individuals. Michael, do you think that in the UK and the US, the response to this story has been different? Of course, in the US, you all pride yourselves on free speech, but is it different in the UK?
I mean, the media has been absolutely awful. I mean, on the whole issue of censorship. I mean, you see the media in both of our countries with more, I would say, with maybe some more exceptions from Britain. I would say from the Telegraph has been pretty good on this issue. And even sometimes when left-wing people are being censored, The Guardian has been a little bit better. But I mean, mostly you've seen journalists, not just, they first of all, they didn't really cover the Twitter files at all, or they dismissed it as a conspiracy theory, even though, of course, it was based on the actual files within Twitter. But they've also been cheering on the censorship. So we would see repeatedly that it was often journalists urging the White House to engage in more demands for censorship by the social media platforms. And we can get into why that is. I think journalists have had a sort of monopoly for many decades on sharing information, and the social media undermines that. And there's also potentially economic competition we can get at. But no, it's I mean, look, here you have the FBI and the CIA proven to have interfered in the 2020 elections by spreading disinformation. And basically nobody knows that in the United States outside of I guess it's probably I would suggest maybe most Republicans at this point know. But Democrats and independents and people that rely on the mainstream media really have no idea that these crimes occurred.
And of course, we're facing a general election in America in November. Do you have hopes that either will take this issue more seriously in their possible administration?
Well, Donald Trump has made it a huge priority. And when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. endorsed Trump last week, Kennedy named it as one of the 3 reasons that he was endorsing Trump. So I do think the Trump administration, they would both, get to the bottom of what happened in terms of censorship. They've said they want a clean house at the FBI and CIA. That clearly needs to happen. You can't have a politicized intelligence agencies. Republicans are very, angry, and they distrustful of the FBI and CIA. I mean, that's really a big problem. The FBI, like all law enforcement organizations, relies on the cooperation of the public. The public has to believe, in order to solve a homicide, you need, people to tell the police what happened, the witnesses and others that have information. And so we know that, that's a huge problem for all crime, is if you don't trust the police, then you can't solve crimes. And so this is really a very serious issue. If you don't clean house at the FBI and CIA and restore that trust, much worse things, can happen. And we certainly saw, we have a long history of problems with these 2 agencies. 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred because the FBI and CIA were failing to share intelligence and work together. Here it appears that they were working together, but in a politicized way. So I'm very worried that a Kamala Harris administration would attempt to restart the kinds of censorship that we saw in 2020, 2021. I haven't even mentioned yet, but I mean, one of the worst aspects of the censorship efforts in 2020 and 2021 were done out of the Department of Homeland Security through third parties, basically the lead group being Stanford, but 3 other NGOs were involved. And they created a mass censorship effort where they were, flagging thousands of posts on Facebook and Twitter, and then going to those companies and urging them to censor that material. And they did about 75% of the time. But nonetheless, I do think that, the Democrats, every time I testified, I was just shocked to hear them, not just, openly calling for more censorship. I mean, I really couldn't believe my ears as a former Democrat that they were doing that. So we're in a kind of panic that really is comparable to the rise of the printing press in the 16th century, where, the owners of the printing press were hiding them. They were moving them to the Netherlands to evade censorship by various governments. And that went on for a really long time. So, the free flow of information threatens established power centers in the society. And so this effort by governments in general and intelligence agencies in particular to gain control over the social media platforms, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think we can expect more of those efforts in years to come.
Finally, Michael, I wanted to ask you about Elon Musk's Twitter notes, which a lot of people have been talking about recently. There are some examples which we can show on the screen here where it's a post and the community Twitter notes will explain why such a post is possibly falsifiable. Do you think that this is a good idea, or could this be, for free speech advocates like yourself, could this be another example of the power being put in the head of the social media app's hands and they get to choose what to censor on the app?
My view is that you don't need community notes, because if somebody posts something wrong, then you can reply right under it, and people can reshare that correction. They can like that correction. There's an expression that people use of a post that's erroneous being ratioed, meaning that there's more replies to the post than sharing of the posts. So that was already there. I think community notes has proven to be a useful correction as well. It's for a selector. It's like not all users have access to it, are able to write them or vote for them. But it has been studied, at least in the case of vaccines, by somebody who, by the way, holds a very mainstream view of vaccines, very pro-vaccine. And they went through and they published a study, and they found, I think it was well over 90%. I think it might have been 95%, but that of the community notes were accurate, so that the community notes corrections on the posts were accurate. So I think it's a great story, because you have to remember that, Elon reduced the staff size of Twitter by something like 75 or 80%. So you had a bunch of, fallible, subjective, mostly left-wing, censors working for Twitter who were going through and trying to decide for themselves what was accurate and inaccurate. And that's where a lot of the censorship and mischief took place. So to see the community notes being used so widely, and it could end up going bad, like all things can go bad. But right now it seems to be working really well, and certainly working better than having outside groups of committees of so-called experts who are always biased deciding what's true and false.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me.